Imagine a masterpiece of modern engineering, a marvel designed to conquer oceans and skies with unparalleled safety, suddenly becoming a lead weight, tumbling uncontrollably from the heavens. How could a fully functional twin-engine jet, bristling with advanced automation, mystifyingly fall out of the sky into the deepest reaches of the Atlantic, without a single component catastrophically failing? This wasn't a Hollywood thriller. It was the terrifying, incomprehensible reality that befell Air France Flight 447, an event that would forever alter the course of aviation, revealing a treacherous dance between human intuition, technological reliance, and the raw, untamed power of nature. The disappearance of Air France Flight 447 on June 1, 2009, sent shockwaves not just through the aviation community, but across the entire globe. It wasn't merely another accident, it was a profound mystery, a stark and chilling void in the heart of the digital age. In an era where every aircraft was a flying supercomputer, constantly broadcasting its position and health, AF 447 simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and an unbearable silence. This tragedy would become a crucible, forging new paradigms in pilot training, challenging the very architecture of automated flight, and forcing a painful, introspective look at the intricate, often fragile relationship between human and machine. It exposed critical vulnerabilities, not just in hardware or software, but in the interface between them, and most poignantly, in the human decision-making process when confronted with data overload and an overwhelming, unfamiliar crisis. What was at stake was nothing less than the future of safe air travel, pushing experts to re-evaluate the fine line between technological advancement and fundamental flying skills, ensuring that the lessons learned from the unfathomable depths of the Atlantic would save countless lives in the skies above. The aircraft itself was an Airbus A330-200, a gleaming symbol of modern aviation, designed to crisscross continents with effortless grace. Imagine it as a giant, sophisticated bird, with a wingspan stretching nearly 60 meters and a length approaching 59 meters, capable of carrying hundreds of souls thousands of miles without a single stop. This particular Airbus, registration FGZCP, was less than 5 years old, practically a newborn in the aviation world, having first taken to the skies in 2005. Its reputation for safety was impeccable, built on the bedrock of Airbus's fly-by-wire technology. This wasn't an old-fashioned plane with clunky cables connecting the cockpit controls directly to the wings and tail. Instead, the A330 was a digital marvel. When the pilots moved the joystick-like side stick, their commands were sent as electronic signals to computers, which then translated them into precise movements of the control surfaces. It was like driving a car where your steering wheel inputs were filtered and refined by a super-intelligent co-pilot, ensuring smoother, more efficient, and seemingly safer flight. This system also came with built-in protections called flight envelope protections, designed to prevent the aircraft from being pushed beyond its safe operational limits, like stalling or overspeeding. Powering this magnificent machine were two General Electric CF680E1 engines, immense turbines, each capable of generating over 70,000 pounds of thrust, enough power to launch a small rocket. These engines were not only robust and reliable, but also remarkably fuel-efficient, allowing the A330-200 to boast an impressive range of over 13,000 kilometers, making transatlantic journeys like the one from Rio to Paris a routine, comfortable experience. Its navigation systems were state-of-the-art, relying on a complex array of sensors, including GPS, inertial reference units, and crucial little devices called pitot tubes. Picture these pitot tubes as the aircraft's high-tech antennae, delicate metal probes protruding from the fuselage, particularly sensitive to the flow of air. They measured the dynamic pressure of the air rushing past the plane, translating that data into the aircraft's airspeed, a fundamental piece of information for flight. Without accurate airspeed data, a pilot is flying blind, unsure of whether they are too fast or too slow, dangerously close to a stall or exceeding safe speeds. These tubes, usually 3 of them to provide redundancy, were the eyes that told the plane how fast it was truly moving through the sky, a seemingly simple yet utterly critical function. The A330, in essence, was a fortress of reliability and automation, a testament to decades of engineering brilliance designed to handle almost any contingency. Its very existence promised a new era of effortless, incident-free air travel. Within this technological marvel were the human hearts and minds that guided it. The cockpit of Air France 447 was commanded by Captain Marc Dubois, a seasoned veteran of the skies with an impressive 11,000 flight hours, nearly 1,700 of them on the A330. Dubois was a father of 3, known for his calm demeanor and extensive experience. He was respected by his peers and had a reputation for meticulous adherence to procedures. Beside him, in the co-pilot seats, were 2 first officers, David Robert with 6,500 flight hours, 4,400 on the A330, and Pierre Cedric Bonin, the youngest of the trio, with 2,900 flight hours, though a significant portion of that was also on the A330. Bonin was enthusiastic and capable, but perhaps still finding his footing in the nuanced demands of long-haul flights, especially during the quiet, automated cruise phases. On such extended voyages, it was standard practice for the crew to rotate, allowing one pilot to rest while 2 others managed the cockpit. For this segment of the flight, Captain Dubois had gone to rest, leaving First Officer Bonin as the pilot flying, PF, and First Officer Robert as the pilot not flying, PNF. The passenger manifest for AF 447 painted a poignant mosaic of lives. 216 passengers from 32 different nationalities, a truly global cross-section. There were families returning home, business executives en route to important meetings, honeymooners and tourists savoring the last moments of their Brazilian adventure. Among them were a Michelin-starred chef, a senior executive from a multinational company, and a young couple with their newborn baby. Each person represented a unique story, a web of connections stretching across continents, all unknowingly sharing a common destiny aboard this particular flight. The cabin crew, 12 strong, were experienced professionals, trained to ensure the comfort and safety of all on board, their smiles and reassuring presence a familiar comfort in the otherwise anonymous environment of commercial air travel. Their journey began on a balmy evening, Sunday, May 31st, 2009, at Rio de Janeiro's Galeão International Airport. The sleek Airbus A330-200, christened Air France 447, prepared for its non-stop, 11-hour, 8,000-kilometer flight across the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, destined for Paris-Charles de Gaulle. The route was a familiar one for Air France, a long, quiet overnight passage. After takeoff at 7:03 p.m. local time, the aircraft climbed steadily, piercing through the Brazilian night sky, heading northeast. The initial hours of the flight were uneventful, a symphony of automation and the distant hum of powerful engines. Passengers settled into their seats, some watching movies, others drifting off to sleep, lulled by the rhythmic drone of the aircraft and the gentle sway of the cabin. Dinner service concluded, lights dimmed, and the great metal bird continued its relentless pursuit of dawn, high above the churning waters of the Atlantic. The crew, in their cocoon of advanced technology, monitored the systems, chatting occasionally, the routine settling over them like a comfortable blanket. However, far ahead on their projected flight path, a different kind of entity was stirring. The meteorological reports had highlighted the presence of the Intertropical Convergence Zone, ICTCZ, a notorious band of turbulent weather that girdles the Earth near the equator. Sailors call it the doldrums, a place where the trade winds meet, churning up immense thunderstorms, fierce updrafts and downdrafts, and supercooled water droplets that can flash freeze upon contact. Pilots knew the ITCZ well, often describing it as a colossal, invisible wall of chaotic weather, a place to be navigated with caution, if not outright avoided. For AF447, it was an unavoidable crossing point. As the hours passed, the aircraft soared deeper into the night, closer to this atmospheric beast. At 1:35 a.m. UTC, the aircraft made its last routine position report to Brazilian Air Traffic Control, confirming its location 565 kilometers northeast of Natal, Brazil. All systems were nominal. Captain Dubois, having briefed his first officers about the impending encounter with the ITCZ, had retired to the rest bunk at 2 a.m. UTC, leaving Bonin and Robert in charge. The atmosphere in the cockpit remained calm, though a sense of heightened awareness was palpable as they prepared to penetrate the turbulent zone. The pilots discussed the weather ahead, noting strong activity on their radar screens. At 2:06 a.m. UTC, First Officer Bonin, recognizing the approaching turbulence, made a PA announcement to the passengers. "In about 10 minutes, we're probably going to go through an area where it's going to be moving around a bit more than at the moment. So I invite you to go back to your seats and attach your seatbelt." A gentle warning, little more than a routine precaution, met with the usual sleepy compliance from the few passengers still awake. The cabin lights remained dimmed, most passengers now firmly asleep, trusting in the metal shell that carried them through the dark. The radar displayed an ominous red patch directly in their path, indicating severe convective activity. First Officer Bonin, aiming for a smoother ride, decided to deviate slightly to the left, initiating a change in course by 3 degrees. This was standard operating procedure, a cautious pilot's move to avoid the worst of the storm. The aircraft, still flying at its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, sliced through the inky blackness, the relentless hum of its engines a steady, comforting lullaby. But within the heart of that storm, an unseen enemy lay in wait, a microscopic peril composed of supercooled water droplets and ice crystals, poised to strike. At approximately 2:10 a.m. UTC, the first insidious whispers of trouble began. The aircraft entered an area of moderate turbulence. Outside, the temperature at cruise altitude hovered around -40 degrees Celsius. Within the next 2 minutes, a series of cascading events would unfold with terrifying speed and devastating consequences. Suddenly, at 2:10:05 UTC, the external temperature probe registered an alarming drop to -50 degrees Celsius. This was a critical temperature, indicating the presence of tiny ice crystals known to disrupt sensitive equipment. Then, without warning, the 3 pitot tubes, those crucial eyes that measured the aircraft's airspeed, began to fail. Blocked by ice, they could no longer provide accurate data to the flight computers. The digital co-pilot, suddenly blinded, couldn't tell how fast it was going. The immediate consequence was a cascade of automated disconnections. At 2:10:07 UTC, the autopilot, confused and starved of reliable airspeed information, abruptly disengaged with a jarring thud and a distinctive high-pitched clack, clack, clack alarm, the warning sound that signals the loss of the trusted robotic pilot. Simultaneously, the auto-thrust system, which managed the engine power, also disconnected. The Airbus, in an instant, transitioned from a fully automated, digitally controlled flight to manual control. First Officer Bonin, now the pilot flying, was abruptly thrust into the unfamiliar territory of flying a large jet through turbulence, manually in the dark, with critical instruments failing. The aircraft's advanced systems, designed for safety, had suddenly, inexplicably stepped aside. A sudden, sharp cavalry charge alert, the unmistakable sound of an ECAM, electronic centralized aircraft monitor warning, pierced the cockpit. Then another and another. A flurry of warning messages flashed across the multifunction displays. NAV ADR disagree, FCTL RUD TRV lim, IR1 fault, AP off, ATHR off. The cockpit, moments ago a picture of serene control, was now awash with flashing lights and a cacophony of alarms, each one screaming a different problem, each vying for the pilot's attention. It was a digital assault on their senses, designed to warn, but now overwhelming. First Officer Robert immediately stated, "We have lost the speeds." Instead of pushing the nose down to gain speed, a common reaction to ensure airflow over the wings in an unexpected situation, he pulled back on his side stick, commanding the aircraft to pitch up. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The aircraft's nose began to climb, taking it higher into the turbulent sky, its speed rapidly bleeding away. Inside the cabin, the gentle turbulence intensified. Passengers stirred in their sleep, unaware of the silent, terrifying drama unfolding just meters away in the cockpit. The aircraft, now without the precise guidance of its speed sensors, was being flown by human hands, but those hands, in a moment of stress and confusion, were making the wrong move, pulling the majestic Airbus towards its ultimate tragic destiny. Then just as the aircraft's pitch angle reached 11 degrees nose up, the terrifying sound of the stall warning reverberated through the cockpit. A continuous, piercing stall. Stall. Stall! Alarm, indicating that the wings were losing the lift necessary to keep the plane airborne. This was the most dreaded sound a pilot could hear. The aircraft was beginning to lose its grip on the sky. Even as First Officer Bonin continued to hold the side stick back, seemingly unaware that his input was driving the plane deeper into a stall. First Officer Robert, witnessing the unfolding disaster, cried out, "No, don't climb!" "Don't climb!" He pushed his side stick forward, attempting to counteract Bonin's input, but the Airbus system, designed to accept the highest input from either pilot, interpreted Bonin's continuous pull as the dominant command. The two pilots were, in essence, fighting against each other and against the very physics of flight. The aircraft's nose continued to rise, its speed rapidly decaying from 275 knots to just 90 knots. At 35,000 feet, a stall was an unthinkable scenario for a modern jet, yet here it was, brought on by a combination of instrument failure and a critical human error. The Airbus, a marvel of automation and stability, was now teetering on the edge of its aerodynamic limits. The stall warning blared relentlessly, an insistent guttural scream in the cockpit. Simultaneously, an alternate law warning illuminated, signifying that the flight control computers, no longer receiving valid airspeed data, had abandoned their normal, protected mode. The aircraft's inherent protections against stalling were now offline, leaving it vulnerable, raw, and at the mercy of direct pilot input. The aircraft was now pitching up at an alarming rate, its nose climbing to 16.2 degrees as its forward momentum gave way to a rapidly developing descent. The luxurious cabin, moments ago a picture of serene rest, was now experiencing extreme G-forces, first pushing passengers deep into their seats, then, as the plane began its descent, lifting them against their seatbelts. Luggage shifted, drinks spilled, and the first whispers of fear began to spread through the waking passengers. At 2:11 UTC, just 53 seconds after the autopilot disconnected, the aircraft began to descend. Its nose was still pointed upwards, its engines roaring, but its wings had ceased to fly. The stall warning, a deafening constant, echoed through the cockpit. First Officer Robert, now fully comprehending the gravity of the situation, tried to alert the resting Captain Dubois, shouting, "Get the captain! Get the captain!" The situation had spiraled from a mere technical glitch to an all-out emergency in a terrifying blink of an eye. The aircraft was falling, its descent rate accelerating, the Atlantic rushing up to meet it with unfathomable speed. The cabin lights flickered, casting eerie shadows, as the sound of the stall warning bled through the cockpit door, a chilling premonition of the abyss that awaited them. The great Airbus A330, a machine designed for grace and ascent, was now plummeting from the sky, a controlled fall turning into an uncontrolled plunge. The altitude indicator spun downwards with frightening speed. At 2:11:40 UTC, less than 90 seconds after the initial pitot tube failure, the cockpit door burst open. Captain Dubois, roused from his rest by the sudden turbulence and the piercing alarms, staggered into the cockpit, his eyes wide, instantly confronted by the chaotic scene. Flashing lights, blaring warnings, and the sight of his two first officers wrestling with the controls, a desperate, confused struggle against an unseen force. He immediately took in the critical information. The stall warning was continuous, the aircraft was in alternate law, and they were rapidly losing altitude. "What's going on?" he demanded, his voice strained against the din, trying to grasp the impossible reality of a stalled, falling Airbus in the middle of the Atlantic night. The fate of 228 souls now rested on the shoulders of these three men, trapped in a metallic shell, tumbling relentlessly towards the vast dark ocean below, with only precious minutes remaining to reverse an already irreversible descent. His eyes, still adjusting from the darkness of the rest bunk, darted across the glowing displays, trying to make sense of the conflicting data. The relentless stall. Stall! Alarm was a primal scream, impossible to ignore, but it clashed with the aircraft's nose-high attitude, a posture that, to a pilot, traditionally suggested climbing. How could a plane be stalled with its nose pointing upwards, its engines roaring, and still falling at an accelerating rate? It defied everything he knew, a brutal contradiction that ripped through decades of flight training. First Officer Robert, his face a mask of terror and desperation, shouted back, "We've lost our speeds! We're in a stall!" His hands were still pushing his side stick forward, trying to break the invisible deadlock, trying to force the nose down, but to no avail. Bonin, seemingly locked in a trance of his own, continued to hold his side stick fully back, an almost reflexive action in response to the perceived loss of lift or the overwhelming desire to climb away from the storm. The aircraft's control system, in its alternate law mode, and without reliable airspeed data, was simply obeying Bonin's direct, persistent input, overriding Robert's desperate attempts to counteract. It was as if two separate wills were fighting for control, but only one, tragically, was being heard by the machine. Below them, the cabin was no longer merely turbulent. The initial gentle sway had given way to violent shuddering and sharp, sickening drops that snatched the breath from lungs. Passengers were violently jolted, their bodies pressed against seatbelts that suddenly felt inadequate, then lifted against them as the plane shifted. Luggage from overhead bins crashed to the floor, mingling with the screams of waking passengers and the frantic cries of children. The cabin crew, trained for emergencies, tried to maintain composure, but the sheer, crushing force of the descent made movement impossible. Lights flickered erratically, plunging the cabin into momentary darkness before blazing back on, casting grotesque shadows on contorted faces. It was the nightmare scenario, brought to life in the black heart of the Atlantic. The stall warning blared, but Bonin offered no explanation for his continued nose-up command. The A330, a sophisticated marvel, had a complex system of alpha-limit protection in its normal law. It would not allow itself to stall. But in alternate law, with unreliable speed, those protections were gone. The continuous stall warning was a direct, undeniable signal that the aircraft was losing aerodynamic lift. Yet the persistent pitch-up command indicated a fundamental misunderstanding or an inability to process the contradictory information under extreme duress. The very design meant to prevent such a catastrophe had, in this specific, unique confluence of events, left them vulnerable. The altimeter continued its terrifying backward spin, 33,000 feet, 30,000 feet, 28,000 feet. The vertical speed indicator showed a descent rate that quickly soared past 10,000 feet per minute, then 15,000, then 18,000. It wasn't just falling, it was being driven into the ocean. The engines, though initially at a high power setting, were throttled back by Bonin at some point during the descent, then advanced again, adding another layer of uncoordinated input to the already dire situation. This oscillating power further complicated the captain's attempts to diagnose the problem, each change in engine noise adding to the maelstrom of conflicting sensory data. Then for a fleeting moment at 2:13:40 UTC, something shifted. Bonin finally pushed his side stick forward, and the continuous stall alarm, which had been blaring for over 2 agonizing minutes, fell silent. It was a brief, precious window, a chance. Robert, sensing the change, immediately reinforced the forward input. The nose began to drop, speed started to build, and for a few agonizing seconds, hope flickered through the cockpit, a phantom possibility of recovery. But before any meaningful aerodynamic stability could be established, Bonin, without warning or explanation, pulled the side stick fully back again. The stall warning immediately returned, louder, more insistent than ever, a death knell in the cacophony. "No. Don't pull up!" Robert screamed, his voice cracking with despair and exhaustion, his physical efforts now failing him as much as the aircraft systems. Captain Dubois, now fully aware of Bonin's persistent input, yelled, "But I'm pitched up!" He was looking at the attitude indicator, which still showed a high nose-up pitch despite the aircraft's rapid descent. He was trying to reconcile the visual information with the auditory alarm, but the complete picture remained elusive, fractured by stress and the limitations of their combined understanding. The mental model of a stall, typically associated with a nose-down attitude or a lack of power, was being shattered by the horrifying reality unfolding around them. A nose-high stall, powered and falling. The 3 men were trapped in a complex web of automation, flawed data, and human reaction, each element feeding into the other, accelerating their plunge. The sea-level pressure readings, normally used for altimeter calibration, were now displayed on their screens, a chilling reminder of how close they were getting to the surface. The temperature outside, previously a source of concern for the pitot tubes, was now irrelevant. The only relevant metric was the rapidly diminishing altitude, a ticking clock counting down their final seconds. The aircraft was now plummeting at an astonishing rate of nearly 11,000 feet per minute, its nose still pointing upwards at 15 degrees, buffeted by the storm, its majestic wings no longer lifting but simply cleaving the air in a terminal descent. At 2:14:28 UTC, Captain Dubois finally understood the full, horrifying scope of the problem. "Climb! Climb! Climb!" he commanded, now fully internalizing the need to escape the stall by pushing the nose down to gain speed, a counterintuitive maneuver in the absence of reliable speed data, but the only way to recover. But it was too late. Robert, seeing the true nature of Bonin's sustained input, cried out, "No, we are still pitched up." The realization of their collective misunderstanding, of the fundamental misdiagnosis, hung heavy in the air, a silent scream of, "Why?" But his hand, his arm, remained locked in its fatal position. The airframe groaned under the immense unnatural stresses, a symphony of destruction in the making. The cockpit was filled with the final frantic calls of men grappling with the unimaginable, as the digital voice of the stall warning screamed its relentless prophecy. The final desperate seconds were marked by a tragic clarity, a dawning horror of what had been missed, what could have been done. Below them, the black churning surface of the Atlantic loomed, no longer a distant abstraction, but an imminent, terrifying reality, rising with horrifying speed to meet the stricken plane. The silence of the deep awaited its new metallic cargo, and the secrets it carried, the answers hidden within the final fragmented whispers of data that would be wrenched from the very core of this fallen marvel. The very instruments designed to warn and protect had, through a cruel twist of fate, conspired with human reflex and confusion to guide this technological wonder to its doom, leaving behind a legacy of questions, a chasm of sorrow, and a terrifying mystery that would haunt the skies for decades to come. His eyes, still adjusting from the darkness of the rest bunk, darted across the glowing displays, trying to make sense of the conflicting data. The relentless stall. Stall! Alarm was a primal scream, impossible to ignore, but it clashed with the aircraft's nose-high attitude, a posture that, to a pilot, traditionally suggested climbing. How could a plane be stalled with its nose pointing upwards, its engines roaring, and still falling at an accelerating rate? It defied everything he knew, a brutal contradiction that ripped through decades of flight training. First Officer Robert, his face a mask of terror and desperation, shouted back, "We've lost our speeds! We're in a stall!" His hands were still pushing his side stick forward, trying to break the invisible deadlock, trying to force the nose down, but to no avail. Bonin, seemingly locked in a trance of his own, continued to hold his side stick fully back, an almost reflexive action in response to the perceived loss of lift or the overwhelming desire to climb away from the storm. The aircraft's control system, in its alternate law mode, and without reliable airspeed data, was simply obeying Bonin's direct, persistent input, overriding Robert's desperate attempts to counteract. It was as if two separate wills were fighting for control, but only one, tragically, was being heard by the machine. Below them, the cabin was no longer merely turbulent. The initial gentle sway had given way to violent shuddering and sharp, sickening drops that snatched the breath from lungs. Passengers were violently jolted, their bodies pressed against seatbelts that suddenly felt inadequate, then lifted against them as the plane shifted. Luggage from overhead bins crashed to the floor, mingling with the screams of waking passengers and the frantic cries of children. The cabin crew, trained for emergencies, tried to maintain composure, but the sheer, crushing force of the descent made movement impossible. Lights flickered erratically, plunging the cabin into momentary darkness before blazing back on, casting grotesque shadows on contorted faces. It was the nightmare scenario, brought to life in the black heart of the Atlantic. The stall warning blared, but Bonin offered no explanation for his continued nose-up command. The A330, a sophisticated marvel, had a complex system of alpha limit protection in its normal law. It would not allow itself to stall. But in alternate law, with unreliable speed, those protections were gone. The continuous stall warning was a direct, undeniable signal that the aircraft was losing aerodynamic lift. Yet the persistent pitch-up command indicated a fundamental misunderstanding or an inability to process the contradictory information under extreme duress. The very design meant to prevent such a catastrophe had, in this specific, unique confluence of events, left them vulnerable. The altimeter continued its terrifying backward spin, 33,000 feet, 30,000 feet, 28,000 feet. The vertical speed indicator showed a descent rate that quickly soared past 10,000 feet per minute, then 15,000, then 18,000. It wasn't just falling, it was being driven into the ocean. The engines, though initially at a high-power setting, were throttled back by Bonin at some point during the descent, then advanced again, adding another layer of uncoordinated input to the already dire situation. This oscillating power further complicated the captain's attempts to diagnose the problem, each change in engine noise adding to the maelstrom of conflicting sensory data. Then for a fleeting moment at 2:13:40 UTC, something shifted. Bonin finally pushed his side stick forward, and the continuous stall alarm, which had been blaring for over 2 agonizing minutes, fell silent. It was a brief, precious window, a chance. Robert, sensing the change, immediately reinforced the forward input. The nose began to drop, speed started to build, and for a few agonizing seconds, hope flickered through the cockpit, a phantom possibility of recovery. But before any meaningful aerodynamic stability could be established, Bonin, without warning or explanation, pulled the side stick fully back again. The stall warning immediately returned, louder, more insistent than ever, a death knell in the cacophony. No. "Don't pull up!" Robert screamed, his voice cracking with despair and exhaustion, his physical efforts now failing him as much as the aircraft's systems. Captain Dubois, now fully aware of Bonan's persistent input, yelled, "But I'm pitched up!" He was looking at the attitude indicator, which still showed a high nose-up pitch despite the aircraft's rapid descent. He was trying to reconcile the visual information with the auditory alarm, but the complete picture remained elusive, fractured by stress and the limitations of their combined understanding. The mental model of a stall, typically associated with a nose-down attitude or a lack of power, was being shattered by the horrifying reality unfolding around them. A nose-high stall, powered and falling. The three men were trapped in a complex web of automation, flawed data, and human reaction, each element feeding into the other, accelerating their plunge. The sea-level pressure readings, normally used for altimeter calibration, were now displayed on their screens, a chilling reminder of how close they were getting to the surface. The temperature outside, previously a source of concern for the pitot tubes, was now irrelevant. The only relevant metric was the rapidly diminishing altitude, a ticking clock counting down their final seconds. The aircraft was now plummeting at an astonishing rate of nearly 11,000 feet per minute, its nose still pointing upwards at 15 degrees, buffeted by the storm, its majestic wings no longer lifting but simply cleaving the air in a terminal descent. At 2:14:28 UTC, Captain Dubois finally understood the full, horrifying scope of the problem. "Climb! Climb! Climb!" he commanded, now fully internalizing the need to escape the stall by pushing the nose down to gain speed, a counterintuitive maneuver in the absence of reliable speed data, but the only way to recover. But it was too late. Robert, seeing the true nature of Bonan's sustained input, cried out, "No, we are still pitched up." The realization of their collective misunderstanding, of the fundamental misdiagnosis, hung heavy in the air, a silent scream of, "Why?" But his hand, his arm, remained locked in its fatal position. The airframe groaned under the immense unnatural stresses, a symphony of destruction in the making. The cockpit was filled with the final frantic calls of men grappling with the unimaginable, as the digital voice of the stall warning screamed its relentless prophecy. The final desperate seconds were marked by a tragic clarity, a dawning horror of what had been missed, what could have been done. The altimeter, a merciless clock, spun past 5,000 feet, then 4,000, then 3,000. Each digit a hammer blow, each passing second a final breath. The cabin, a swirling vortex of debris and terror, was filled with the guttural roars of engines, fighting a losing battle against aerodynamics and gravity, punctuated by the high-pitched screams of the stall warning bleeding through the cockpit door. Passengers, now fully awake and comprehending, clung to anything they could, their faces etched with pure primal fear. The comforting hum of flight, replaced by a terrifying, accelerating roar of wind and structural strain. The air itself thick with the scent of ozone and despair. In the cockpit, Captain Dubois, his voice now raspy, made one last desperate attempt. "Give me the controls," he commanded, trying to assert authority, to break the spell of fatal error. But in the chaos, amidst the blaring alarms and the sheer physical forces shaking the aircraft apart, the standard procedure for transferring control became another casualty. Bonan's side stick remained pulled back, a ghost in the machine, and the Airbus, designed to interpret this as the primary, highest priority input, continued its controlled yet uncontrollable descent into the abyss. Robert, seeing the futility, could only shout a final, heart-wrenching, "We're going to crash!" "This is not happening!" A denial echoing the utter incomprehensibility of their situation. The airspeed, though unreliable, flickered erratically, showing absurdly low numbers, even as the aircraft plunged at over 10,000 feet per minute. The angle of attack, the true indicator of their peril, remained dangerously high, the wings still defiantly biting at the air, trying to create lift where none could be found in their current state. Outside, in the pitch-black pre-dawn, lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the colossal frothing waves of the Atlantic, now rising up to meet them with terrifying speed. The rain, no longer a drizzle but a torrential downpour, hammered against the windshield, blurring the already non-existent horizon. The flight control computers, in their alternate law state, continued to respond faithfully to Bonin's persistent, erroneous command, a chilling testament to the unforgiving logic of a system stripped of its protective layers. The complex algorithms designed to safeguard had become tools of destruction in this unique confluence of events. A perfect storm of environmental chaos, sensor failure, and human cognitive overload. No single component had truly failed catastrophically in the traditional sense. Rather, the entire system, human and machine, had entered an unexpected, unrecoverable state, a lethal feedback loop. Then at 2:14:28 UTC, as the aircraft passed through approximately 2,000 feet, the aircraft sent its final batch of ACARS, aircraft communications addressing and reporting system messages. These weren't routine reports. They were a frantic, automated burst, a digital death rattle. Vertical speed, FCTL pitch trim, anti-ice pitot, IRS fault, a final desperate cry from the dying machine, detailing every system in disarray, a final testament to the cascading failures that had sealed its fate. These messages, time-stamped and transmitted automatically, would be the last whispers from Flight 447, traveling through the ether just moments before the final plunge, a chilling epilogue to a story still unfolding. The sound of the stall warning ceased abruptly, not because the stall had been recovered, but because the aircraft's internal systems were now too compromised to even register the impending doom. It was replaced by a new, horrifying roar, the sound of the entire airframe being torn apart by the immense aerodynamic forces, the tearing of metal, the shattering of dreams. The cabin lights died, plunging everything into absolute darkness, illuminated only by the frantic flashes of lightning and the final, terrifying sight of the churning black ocean rushing up to meet them. The last thing anyone might have seen in those final microseconds before the world dissolved into a cacophony of metal, water, and terror was the impossible, inverted reflection of the plane's own landing lights on the monstrous waves, a surreal, final vision of a sky-bound marvel now plunging headfirst into the abyss, leaving behind only an echoing void and a mystery that would take years to even begin to unravel. The impact was not a single deafening explosion, but a brutal, instantaneous disintegration. The sheer force of the 200-ton aircraft, plummeting at hundreds of feet per second, meeting the unyielding surface of the Atlantic, created a pressure wave that registered on distant seismographs, a silent, subterranean scream. Metal shrieked, water pulverized, and in a fraction of a second, the Airbus A330, its 228 souls and their stories, ceased to exist as a cohesive whole. Then, just as abruptly as the chaos had erupted, an unnatural, profound silence descended upon that patch of ocean. The storm raged on, but the human sounds, the mechanical roars, the alarms, all were swallowed by the vast, indifferent deep. The blackness was absolute, pierced only by the occasional flash of lightning, illuminating the now empty, churning waves. Back on land, the silence was equally chilling, but slow to arrive. The last ACARS messages from Flight 447, a digital death knell of system failures, were received by Air France maintenance at 2:14 UTC. Initially, they were treated with a degree of alarm, but also a sense of routine, an aircraft passing through a storm, perhaps encountering some turbulence and system glitches. It wasn't until a full hour passed, then two, and the aircraft failed to make its scheduled position report with Dakar, Senegal, that the first tendrils of true dread began to snake through the control centers. An Air France dispatch center tried repeatedly to establish contact, their calls echoing into a void of static. As dawn broke over the Atlantic, painting the sky with hues of innocent pink and orange, the grim reality solidified. Air France Flight 447 was missing. The initial assumption was a catastrophic structural failure, perhaps a lightning strike or severe turbulence tearing the plane apart. But even in such scenarios, there were protocols, emergency locator transmitters, ELTs, designed to ping their location, a distress signal, a final, desperate radio call. From AF 447 there was nothing. Just those cryptic ACARS messages, a puzzle without its border pieces. The silence was not just terrifying, it was perplexing. How could a state-of-the-art aircraft, designed with redundancies for every conceivable failure, simply vanish without a trace? The vastness of the South Atlantic, a watery expanse larger than several continents combined, suddenly became an overwhelming hostile adversary. The search began almost immediately, a desperate international effort spearheaded by the Brazilian Air Force and Navy, later joined by French and other nations' assets. Patrol planes crisscrossed the designated flight path. Naval vessels steamed towards the last known position, their crews scanning the endless waves with binoculars. Hope was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the sheer scale of the ocean. Days bled into weeks, and the initial findings were heartbreakingly scarce and deeply confusing. Small, disconnected pieces of debris were eventually spotted, an orange life vest, a seat cushion, a piece of luggage. But these fragments, rather than providing answers, only deepened the mystery. They were not indicative of a high-speed, catastrophic breakup. They suggested a more controlled, albeit fatal, descent. Yet the black boxes, the flight data recorder FDR and cockpit voice recorder CVR, the crucial arbiters of truth, remained stubbornly silent. Their acoustic beacons, designed to emit a ping for at least 30 days, were either inoperative or buried too deep for detection. The search area was a mind-boggling 17,000 square kilometers, and the ocean floor below was a jagged, mountainous landscape plunging to depths of over 4,000 meters, deeper than the Grand Canyon is wide. It was a realm of crushing pressure, perpetual darkness, and abyssal currents, an environment utterly inhospitable to human exploration. Recovering anything from such depths would be an unprecedented feat of engineering and perseverance. Families of the victims, clutching photographs of their loved ones, gathered in Rio and Paris, their grief compounded by the agonizing lack of information, the terrible unknown. They demanded answers, their voices a rising chorus against the deafening silence of the Atlantic. Investigators from France's Bureau of Inquiry and Analysis for Civil Aviation Safety, BEA, faced an unparalleled challenge. Without the black boxes, all they had were the automated ACARS messages, a few radar tracks that abruptly ended, and the scattered ambiguous debris. The preliminary analysis of these fragments, particularly the lack of extensive charring or a widespread debris field, hinted that the aircraft likely entered the water largely intact, though at immense speed and in an unusual attitude. But why? Why the stall warning, the pilot inputs, the lack of recovery? The puzzle pieces didn't fit the expected narrative of a modern air disaster. The world watched, baffled, as the greatest aviation mystery of the digital age unfolded, a stark reminder that even the most advanced technology remained vulnerable, not just to the caprices of nature, but to the intricate, often unpredictable dance between human and machine. The ocean held its secrets tightly, and the hunt for the black boxes became a desperate race against time, a last, faint hope to pierce the veil of the unknown before the pings faded forever, leaving the chilling fate of Flight 447 to be forever shrouded in the abyssal darkness. The acoustic beacons on the black boxes, designed to send out their faint, telltale pings for a maximum of 30 days, were rapidly approaching their operational limit. Each passing hour diminished the already infinitesimal chances of locating them in the colossal, pitch-black abyss. The initial frantic aerial and surface search had yielded little more than floating fragments, each piece a heartbreaking confirmation of the tragedy, yet simultaneously a frustrating clue. A piece of a vertical stabilizer, retrieved relatively intact, didn't fit the profile of a high-speed breakup. Why was it so clean? The lack of charring, the absence of extensive ripping characteristic of mid-air disintegration, suggested a controlled, albeit catastrophic, impact with the water. But this contradicted the ACAR's messages that screamed system failures, and the terrifying cockpit drama revealed by later analysis. The paradox gnawed at the investigators. The vastness of the search zone became the primary antagonist. Over 1 million square kilometers of ocean had to be scoured, an area larger than France itself, much of it previously uncharted in terms of its seafloor topography. Sonar equipment, initially deployed from surface vessels, battled the immense depths, the sound waves scattering and dissipating, creating a bewildering cacophony of false echoes and geological noise. Deep-towed sonars, expensive and excruciatingly slow, crawled across the seafloor, attempting to map the mountainous terrain, but it was like searching for a needle in a hayfield, with the added torment of crushing pressures and freezing temperatures. Every false positive, every detection of a geological anomaly that mimicked a piece of aircraft, was a fresh wave of hope, followed by crushing despair. The media, initially focused on the shock of the disappearance, now fixated on the human drama, the grieving families, the tireless search crews, and the seemingly inexplicable silence from a vanished modern marvel. Conspiracy theories, outlandish and desperate, began to circulate, fueled by the void of information. Had it been terrorism? An alien abduction? A new Bermuda Triangle? The BEA, bound by strict protocols and a sober commitment to facts, had nothing concrete to offer, only a growing sense of unease. The retrieved debris, few and far between, spoke more of an aircraft that had fallen than one that had exploded. This only deepened the mystery. How could such an advanced aircraft, designed to be practically foolproof, simply fall out of the sky without some dramatic, undeniable cataclysm? Within the investigation teams, a quiet yet intense debate began to simmer. The initial focus had been on mechanical failure, faulty pitot tubes, a structural flaw, an engine anomaly. But the more the fragmented data was analyzed, the more the attention began to shift towards the human element. The ACAR's messages hinted at an airspeed discrepancy, but they didn't explain the sustained stall. Could the crew have mismanaged the situation to such a catastrophic degree? It was a deeply uncomfortable question, verging on sacrilege in the aviation community, which often lionized its pilots as ultimate problem solvers. But the data, scant as it was, suggested a failure not just of instruments, but of interpretation, of action, of the fundamental relationship between man and machine. As the 30-day mark loomed, the desperate race against time intensified. The pings from the black boxes, already faint and elusive, grew weaker with each passing hour, their energy sources draining. Specialized submersibles, autonomous underwater vehicles, AUVs, equipped with sensitive hydrophones, were deployed, meticulously traversing grid by grid, hoping to catch the slightest whisper from the deep. These robots, operating in total darkness and under immense pressure, were the last hope. Their internal clocks were synchronized with the estimated lifespan of the pingers, a countdown that fueled the mounting anxiety. Every successful deployment, every square kilometer searched, was a minor victory against the overwhelming odds, but the silence from the deep persisted. Then on June 23, 2009, just days before the pings were expected to cease entirely, a fleeting, almost imperceptible whisper was detected by one of the advanced hydrophones. It was not a clear, strong signal, but a faint, almost statistical anomaly, a fleeting blip among the natural sounds of the ocean. It came from the general vicinity of the last known radar track, but it was agonizingly weak, easily lost in the ambient noise, and quickly faded before it could be triangulated. Was it a real ping, or merely an underwater echo, a phantom signal born of desperate hope? The investigators held their breath, replaying the data, their hearts pounding in their chests. The window was closing, irrevocably. The abyss was about to reclaim its secrets forever, just as a tantalizing, agonizingly brief whisper hinted that something truly extraordinary and terrifying lay hidden in the depths, waiting to be found and understood. The elusive whisper, barely a statistical anomaly against the ocean's vast acoustic backdrop, was more a desperate prayer answered than a clear signal. It wasn't enough to pinpoint the black boxes, but it was enough to rekindle a flicker of hope, a tantalizing hint that the abyss might not have swallowed Flight 447 whole without a trace. The operational window for the pingers was closing irrevocably, but the faint, fleeting detection, coupled with the profound lack of answers, spurred an unprecedented decision. The search would continue, even as the beacons fell silent. Months bled into a year, then almost two. The international effort evolved, shifting from an acoustic hunt to an exhaustive visual and sonar mapping of the seafloor. This was no longer just about locating debris. It was about meticulously surveying an area larger than many countries, in depths where sunlight never penetrated. Cutting-edge technology, including autonomous underwater vehicles, AUVs, from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, became the tireless, silent pioneers of this alien landscape. These robots, programmed to follow intricate search patterns, methodically combed the abyssal plains and jagged underwater mountains, their high-resolution sonars painting detailed pictures of the ocean floor, searching for any anomaly, any unnatural protrusion that might hint at the wreckage of AF447. The costs soared into the tens of millions. The odds remained astronomically against success, but the commitment to understanding, to finding closure for the grieving families, never wavered. Then on April 3, 2011, nearly 2 years after the disappearance, a new image appeared on a monitor thousands of feet above the Atlantic. It wasn't a natural rock formation. It was a perfectly circular object, unmistakably a landing gear wheel, half buried in the sediment. Nearby, the unmistakable structure of a wing section. The debris field was finally found, remarkably concentrated, almost as if the aircraft had impacted largely intact, a chilling confirmation of the initial, puzzling deductions. Within days, the search teams descended, deploying remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, to the crushing depths. And there they were, nestled amongst the fragmented fuselage, remarkably preserved by the frigid, oxygen-starved environment, the bright orange flight data recorder, FDR, and the cockpit voice recorder, CVR. The ocean, after guarding its secrets for 700 days, finally yielded the truth. The recovery of the black boxes, though a logistical marvel, was only the beginning. The real work began in the BEA's laboratories in Paris, where forensic experts painstakingly extracted and analyzed the data. As the bytes were recovered and the audio traces filtered, the chilling story of AF447's final moments began to unfold, revealing a complex and tragic interplay of factors, a nightmare distilled into digital whispers. The FDR confirmed the pitot tube icing and the subsequent loss of reliable airspeed data, just as the ACAR's messages had indicated. It showed the autopilot and autothrust disconnecting. But then, the data revealed the most critical and agonizing detail: First Officer Bonin's persistent, almost unwavering nose-up input on his side stick. For over 4 minutes, the aircraft was held in a full aerodynamic stall, its nose pointed upwards, its engines at high thrust, but its wings unable to generate lift. The CVR provided the human counterpoint to this terrifying data. The continuous stall. Alarm blared for the vast majority of the descent, ignored or misinterpreted by the pilots, who were fixated on a perceived lack of altitude rather than the actual stall. The cockpit dialogue, a harrowing transcript of confusion and escalating panic, became the starkest revelation. It showed First Officer Roberts' desperate attempts to push the nose down, his commands overridden by Bonin's persistent pull. It revealed Captain Dubois' struggle to comprehend the situation upon his return, attempting to diagnose a problem under unimaginable duress, only moments before impact. The fundamental issue wasn't a catastrophic mechanical failure, but a critical breakdown in the human-machine interface, exacerbated by a lack of training for such a specific, counterintuitive, high-altitude stall with unreliable airspeed scenario. The highly automated Airbus, in a rare moment when its protections were disengaged, reverted to a more manual flight regime, one the pilots were ill-prepared to handle under extreme stress, and where their ingrained responses proved fatal. The findings sent shockwaves through the aviation world, even greater than the initial disappearance. They redefined the concept of pilot error, shifting it from simple negligence to a complex issue of training, cognitive psychology, and automation reliance. It wasn't just about what the pilots did, but about what they didn't understand, and how the advanced systems designed to be infallible could, in a rare convergence of events, lead them astray. From the tragic depths of AF447's crash emerged a new paradigm for aviation safety. Pilot training underwent a fundamental overhaul. The focus shifted from merely operating automated systems to re-emphasizing core manual flying skills. Pilots were now explicitly trained for upset recovery, learning to recognize and react to high-altitude stalls, even when instrument readings were contradictory or unreliable. The importance of understanding the aircraft's flight laws, what happens when protections are lost, became paramount. Airbus, in turn, refined its pitot tubes and modified its stall warning systems to be more insistent and less ambiguous, even with unreliable airspeed data. The industry acknowledged that the human element, far from being replaced by automation, needed to be better integrated, better understood, and better prepared for the unexpected. The story of Air France Flight 447, once an impenetrable mystery, became a profound, albeit painful lesson. It laid bare the delicate balance between human intuition and technological reliance, demonstrating that even in the most sophisticated machines, the human hand and mind remain the ultimate arbiters of safety. The 228 souls lost in the Atlantic that night were not forgotten. Their tragedy served as a crucible, forging a safer sky for millions who would follow. The black boxes, brought up from the crushing darkness, didn't just tell the story of a crash. They illuminated the path forward, ensuring that the unfathomable depths of the Atlantic would forever hold not just a memory of loss, but a testament to an industry's unyielding commitment to learning, evolving, and ultimately safeguarding the future of flight. The silence of the deep, once a symbol of an unanswered question, now held the solemn echoes of lessons learned, forever whispered in the ceaseless hum of every aircraft that now safely crosses the vast expanse of the world's oceans.